There are secrets families keep to protect their reputation. There are secrets they keep out of shame. And then there are secrets so monstrous, so incomprehensible, that when they're finally discovered, they shatter not just a family, but an entire community's understanding of what human beings are capable of. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host. And before we uncover one of the most disturbing family secrets in American history, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The stories we tell here are the ones that reveal the darkness that can hide behind closed doors for decades. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story takes place in the idyllic town of Lenox, Massachusetts. But its horror could have happened anywhere. Today, we're traveling to 1960, to a beautiful Victorian mansion in the Berkshire Mountains, to a wealthy, respected family with a secret locked in their attic. A secret that had been there for 30 years. A secret that, when finally exposed, would reveal a level of cruelty and neglect so extreme that investigators would struggle to find words to describe what they had found. This is the story of what was hidden in the attic of the Ashworth estate. And it's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, duty, and the limits of human compassion. Lenox, Massachusetts, 1960. This small town in the Berkshire Mountains is known for its natural beauty, its cultural institutions, and its wealthy residents. It's home to Tanglewood, the summer residence of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Its streets are lined with elegant mansions built during the Gilded Age, when industrialists and financiers created their own private paradise in the hills. The Ashworth family has been part of Lenox society since the 1890s. Their mansion, Hillcrest Manor, sits on 20 acres of manicured grounds on the outskirts of town. It's a sprawling 3-story Victorian with turrets, wraparound porches, and the kind of architectural details that speak of old money and established status. By 1960, the family consists of Richard Ashworth, age 72, a retired banker. His wife Margaret, age 68, a former socialite who now rarely leaves the house. And their unmarried daughter, Catherine, age 45, who serves as her parents' caretaker and manages the household. The Ashworths are known as private people. They don't entertain much anymore. They attend church services irregularly. They keep to themselves, which their neighbors attribute to age and old-fashioned propriety. In a town full of wealthy eccentrics, the Ashworths are unremarkable. The house employs only minimal staff, a gardener who comes twice a week, a grocery delivery service, and occasionally a handyman for repairs. But no live-in help. No housekeepers with access to the upper floors. Catherine insists she prefers to manage the household herself. This arrangement has been in place for decades. And for decades, no one has questioned it. On March 15, 1960, Richard Ashworth suffers a massive heart attack. An ambulance is called, and paramedics arrive at Hillcrest Manor within 20 minutes. But it's too late. Richard is pronounced dead in the downstairs parlor, with Margaret and Catherine at his side. The death itself is unremarkable. A 72-year-old man with a history of heart trouble. But Richard's death sets in motion a series of events that will expose what has been hidden in the Ashworth attic for 3 decades. With Richard gone, Margaret Ashworth's mental state deteriorates rapidly. She becomes confused, agitated, speaking incoherently. She keeps asking about checking on Harold and making sure Harold has his medicine. Catherine tries to calm her mother, but Margaret becomes more insistent. "We have to check on Harold," she says repeatedly. "He'll be so upset about Richard. We have to tell Harold." The family doctor, Dr. James Morrison, is called to sedate Margaret. When he arrives, he asks Catherine about Harold. Is there another family member he doesn't know about? A brother, Richard? A relative who needs to be notified? Catherine becomes pale and evasive. "Mother is confused," she says. She's talking about someone from the past, someone who died long ago. But Margaret won't let it go. Even sedated, she keeps mumbling about Harold, about the attic, about 30 years of secrecy. Dr. Morrison, concerned about Margaret's mental state and confused by her rambling, suggests she might need psychiatric evaluation. Catherine resists, insisting her mother just needs time to grieve, but Dr. Morrison mentions the conversation to his wife that evening, and his wife mentions it to her bridge club, and within days the gossip has spread through Lenox. The Ashworths have been hiding something. Someone named Harold. Something in the attic. On March 22, 1960, 1 week after Richard's death, social workers from the county arrive at Hillcrest Manor. They've received an anonymous tip, likely from someone who heard the gossip, that there may be an incapacitated person living in the house who's being neglected. Catherine refuses to let them in. She stands at the door, blocking their entry, insisting there's no one else in the house, that her mother is simply grief-stricken and confused. But the social workers have a court order. They push past Catherine and begin searching the house. They check the first floor, the second floor, the bedrooms, bathrooms, closets. They find nothing unusual. Then they notice the narrow door at the end of the second floor hallway. It's locked. Catherine insists it's just a storage attic, full of old furniture and boxes. Nothing of interest. But one of the social workers, a woman named Dorothy Miller, insists they check anyway. Catherine refuses to provide the key, so they force the door open. Beyond it, a narrow staircase leads up into darkness. The smell that emanates from above is overwhelming human waste, rot, sickness, and something else. Something that speaks of years of confinement and suffering. Dorothy Miller climbs the stairs, a handkerchief pressed to her nose. What she finds in that attic will haunt her for the rest of her life. The attic of Hillcrest Manor was large, running the full length of the house under the peaked roof. But it had been converted into something else, a prison, a cage, a place where someone had been kept locked away from the world. In the far corner, chained to the wall by a long metal tether, was a man. He was skeletal thin, his skin pale and covered in sores. His hair and beard were long and matted. He was wearing what appeared to be a nightshirt, filthy and tattered. He lay curled on a stained mattress on the floor, surrounded by buckets of waste and scraps of rotting food. When Dorothy Miller's flashlight beam hit him, he flinched and covered his eyes, making a low moaning sound. He appeared unable to speak, or unwilling to. His movements were slow and stiff, as if his joints had atrophied from disuse. Dorothy stumbled back down the stairs, gasping, crying. "Call an ambulance," she managed to say. "Call the police. There's a man up there. Dear God, there's a man chained up there." Within the hour, Hillcrest Manor was swarming with police, paramedics, social workers, and reporters who had somehow gotten word of what was happening. The quiet street was filled with emergency vehicles, their lights flashing against the elegant Victorian facades. Paramedics carefully entered the attic and assessed the man's condition. He was alive, but barely. Severely malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from bed sores, infections, and what appeared to be complete muscle atrophy. He couldn't walk. He could barely move. He seemed terrified of the strangers surrounding him. The chain around his ankle had been there so long that it had worn grooves into his skin and bone. Removing it required bolt cutters and would later require surgery. The man was carefully carried down the narrow attic stairs and transported to Lenox Hospital. The medical staff there had never seen anything like it. A human being who had been kept in captivity for so long that he had lost almost all ability to function. And the most horrifying question was, who was he? Catherine Ashworth was taken into custody and questioned by police. At first, she refused to answer any questions, sitting in silence with her arms crossed, her face expressionless. But when confronted with the reality that she would be charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempted murder if she didn't cooperate, she finally began to talk. The man in the attic was Harold Ashworth, her brother. He was 48 years old, and he had been locked in that attic for 30 years. The story Catherine told police was as heartbreaking as it was horrifying. Harold had been born in 1912, the second child of Richard and Margaret Ashworth. From birth, it was clear something was wrong. Harold had severe developmental disabilities, what would today likely be diagnosed as cerebral palsy or a similar condition. He couldn't walk properly, his speech was limited, and as he grew older, it became clear he would never be able to live independently. In 1912, families had few options for children with disabilities. Institutions existed, but they were often horrific places, overcrowded, understaffed, more like prisons than hospitals. Wealthy families like the Ashworths could afford private care, and initially, that's what they did. Harold had nurses, therapists, special tutors. But as Harold grew older and his disabilities didn't improve, Richard and Margaret became increasingly concerned about their social standing. Having a disabled child was seen as shameful in their social circle. Some people believed disabilities were signs of moral or genetic inferiority. The Ashworths, proud of their family name and position in society, couldn't bear the stigma. According to Catherine, in 1930, when Harold was 18 years old, Richard and Margaret made a decision. They told their friends and acquaintances that Harold had died. They held a small private funeral service. They had a gravestone placed in the family plot, but Harold hadn't died. He had been moved to the attic. Catherine, then just 15 years old, was told it was for Harold's own good, that the world would be cruel to him, that he would be happier in the quiet safety of the attic than in some horrible institution or being gawked at by strangers. She was told it was temporary, just until they could find a proper solution, just until things settled down, but temporary became permanent. Weeks became months, became years, became decades. Catherine took over Harold's care when she was in her 20s. Every day for the past 20 years, she had climbed those attic stairs to bring Harold food and water, to empty his waste buckets, to change his clothes, sometimes to speak to him, though he rarely responded. She claimed she had wanted to get him real medical care, to let him out, to give him a life. But her parents had forbidden it, and after years of keeping the secret, she didn't know how to undo it. How do you explain that your brother didn't die 30 years ago, that he's been locked in your attic all this time? Who would understand? Who would forgive? So she kept the secret, day after day, year after year, climbing those stairs, bringing barely adequate food, watching her brother deteriorate, and telling herself it was what her parents wanted, that she had no choice. Harold Ashworth's condition, when he was removed from the attic, shocked even experienced medical professionals. Dr. Thomas Sullivan, who treated Harold at Lenox Hospital, later testified that in his 30 years of practice, he had never seen a case of such prolonged and severe neglect. Harold weighed just 87 pounds, approximately half what he should have weighed for his height and frame. His muscles had atrophied to the point where he couldn't support his own weight. His bones were brittle from lack of sunlight and vitamin D. He had multiple infections, severe bed sores that had eroded down to the bone in some places, and dental decay so extensive that most of his teeth would need to be removed. But the physical damage, as severe as it was, wasn't the worst of it. Harold had been isolated from human contact, from sunlight, from any stimulation or enrichment for 30 years. He had spent his entire adult life in a single room, chained to a wall, with only minimal interaction with Catherine. Psychologists who evaluated Harold found it difficult to assess his mental state. He was largely nonverbal, though it was unclear whether this was due to his original disabilities or to 3 decades of isolation. He seemed terrified of open spaces and bright lights. He wouldn't make eye contact. He rocked back and forth constantly, a self-soothing behavior common in people who've experienced extreme isolation. The question that haunted everyone who learned about Harold was, had he understood what was being done to him? Did he know he had been locked away? Did he remember a time before the attic? Did he comprehend that 3 decades of his life had been stolen? We'll never know for certain. Harold never recovered enough to communicate clearly about his experience. But the fact that we don't know makes it, in some ways, even more terrible. He may have spent 30 years aware that he was a prisoner, unable to escape, unable to make anyone understand his suffering. Margaret Ashworth, when questioned by police, was clearly in the advanced stages of dementia. She seemed confused about timelines, sometimes talking about Harold as if he were still a young boy, other times seeming to recognize that decades had passed. She expressed no remorse, no acknowledgement that what had been done to Harold was wrong. "We took care of him," she insisted. "He was fed. He was clothed. What else could we do? The world would have been cruel to him. We protected him." This rationalization that locking Harold away was for his own good, that it was protection rather than abuse, seemed to be something the Ashworths had truly convinced themselves of over the years. They had taken an act of profound cruelty and reframed it, in their minds, as an act of love. Catherine Ashworth's case was more complex. Prosecutors had to determine, was she a perpetrator or a victim? She had been only 15 when Harold was first locked away. She had been raised to obey her parents without question. And yet, for the past 20 years, as an adult, she had continued the abuse. She had fed Harold just enough to keep him alive, but not enough to maintain his health. She had never sought medical care for him. She had never tried to free him or seek help. The trial of Catherine Ashworth began in September 1960 and became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the man in the attic and 30 years of secret captivity. The details that emerged during the trial were increasingly disturbing. Evidence presented showed that Catherine had kept detailed journals documenting Harold's care or lack thereof. These journals revealed a clinical detachment from her brother's suffering. She wrote about his declining health the way someone might write about an inconvenient household problem. H's bedsores worsening, one entry read. Will need to adjust how often I turn him. Father says we cannot call a doctor. Another entry from 1955. H very weak today. Barely ate. Mother says perhaps it's for the best. I don't know what she means by that. The journal suggested that by the 1950s, Richard and Margaret had essentially stopped caring whether Harold lived or died. They wanted the problem to simply go away. And Catherine, trapped in her role as dutiful daughter, continued to provide just enough care to keep Harold alive. But no more. The prosecution argued that Catherine was guilty of false imprisonment, assault, and attempted murder through gross neglect. They painted her as a woman who had willingly participated in torturing her disabled brother for decades. The defense argued that Catherine was a victim of her parents' psychological abuse, that she had been groomed from age 15 to see her brother's imprisonment as normal and necessary, and that she lacked the psychological capacity to break free from her parents' control, even as an adult. The trial revealed more disturbing details about life at Hillcrest Manor. Neighbors testified that they had never seen or heard anything unusual, never suspected anything was wrong. The Ashworths had been so careful, so deliberate in their deception, that no one had any idea what was happening in that attic. A few witnesses came forward with fragments of memory that, in hindsight, seemed significant. A former grocery delivery boy remembered that the Ashworths always bought more food than seemed necessary for 3 people. But he'd assumed they just had large appetites or wasted a lot. A handyman who had done repairs at the house in the 1940s remembered Catherine, asking him to install a heavier lock on the attic door. But he hadn't thought it strange wealthy people often had valuables in their attics. Dr. Morrison, the family physician, testified that he had treated the Ashworth family for various ailments over the years. But he had never been asked to examine anyone named Harold. He had been told the family consisted of only Richard, Margaret, and Catherine. The most damning testimony came from hospital records. When Harold was finally examined, doctors found evidence of old injuries that had healed incorrectly broken bones that had mended without medical intervention, injuries consistent with falls or physical abuse. These injuries dated back years, possibly decades. This suggested that at various points during his captivity, Harold had been seriously hurt, and no medical care had been sought. He had simply been left to heal on his own, or not heal at all. The defense called expert witnesses to testify about Catherine's psychological state. They described her as suffering from a form of learned helplessness, a condition where prolonged abuse and control strips someone of their ability to recognize they have choices or agency. 1. Psychologists testified that Catherine had been effectively brainwashed by her parents from adolescence, taught that Harold's imprisonment was necessary and right, and that to question it would be to betray her family. By the time she was old enough to potentially help Harold, she was so psychologically damaged that she couldn't conceive of acting against her parents' wishes. The jury listened to weeks of testimony. They saw photographs of the attic, of Harold's condition, of the chains and the squalor. They read Catherine's journals. They heard from medical experts about the extent of Harold's suffering. On November 3, 1960, after 3 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty of false imprisonment and reckless endangerment, but not guilty of attempted murder. The jury seemed to accept that Catherine had been a victim of her parents' psychological manipulation. Even as they recognized she had committed serious crimes, Catherine Ashworth was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called the case one of the most tragic and complex I have encountered in my years on the bench. "You were complicit in a profound cruelty," he told Catherine, "but you were also, in some sense, a victim yourself." This sentence reflects both realities. Margaret Ashworth was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric facility, where she died 3 months later, still apparently believing she had done nothing wrong. Richard Ashworth had escaped justice through death, but his name would forever be associated with one of the most notorious cases of family abuse in American history. And Harold Ashworth was transferred to a specialized care facility that could provide the medical attention and therapeutic support he desperately needed. But the damage done by 30 years of captivity was irreversible. He never learned to walk again. He never regained the ability to speak more than a few words. He remained terrified of enclosed spaces and had violent panic attacks when doors were closed or when he was left alone. He lived for another 18 months after his rescue, dying in October 1961 of pneumonia. He was 49 years old. His entire adult life had been stolen from him, and he never got the chance to experience freedom, to know what life could have been like outside that attic. He was buried in the Ashworth family plot, next to the false grave that had been placed there in 1930. His real grave marker reads simply, Harold James Ashworth, 1912 to 1961, finally free. The Harold Ashworth case sent shockwaves through American society in 1960. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat people with disabilities. about family secrets, and about the capacity for cruelty that can hide behind respectable facades. The case became a catalyst for reform in disability rights. Advocates used Harold's story to push for better protections for people with disabilities, for mandatory reporting of suspected abuse, and for regular welfare checks on vulnerable individuals. In 1963, President Kennedy signed legislation that provided federal funding for community-based care for people with intellectual disabilities, moving away from the institutionalization model. While Kennedy's personal connection to disability, his sister, Rosemary, had been institutionalized after a lobotomy, was the primary driver. The Harold Ashworth case was frequently cited as an example of what happens when families are given too much unchecked control over disabled relatives. The case also led to changes in how missing persons reports were handled. The fact that Harold had supposedly died in 1930, complete with a funeral and grave marker, but no death certificate had been filed or doctor consulted, should have raised red flags. New protocols were established, requiring medical certification of death and proper documentation. But perhaps the most significant impact was on public consciousness. The Harold Ashworth case became a reference point for discussions about family abuse, about the dangers of privileging privacy over welfare, and about society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. Hillcrest Manor stood empty for years after the trial. No one wanted to buy the house where such horror had occurred. It became a local landmark of sorts, a dark tourism destination where curious people would drive by slowly, pointing at the attic windows, imagining the suffering that had occurred behind them. In 1975, the house was finally purchased by a developer who subdivided it into luxury condominiums. The attic was completely renovated, all traces of its dark history removed. Current residents know about what happened, but most prefer not to discuss it. I visited Lenox in 2024, 64 years after Harold's rescue. I drove past what used to be Hillcrest Manor, now divided into 4 separate units, each worth over $1 million. Its beautiful restored Victorian architecture, manicured lawns, the Berkshire Mountains rising in the background. There's no historical marker, no plaque acknowledging what happened there. Just a beautiful building with a terrible past. I spoke to a few locals who remembered the case. One elderly woman, who had been a teenager in 1960, recalled the shock that had rippled through the community. "We couldn't believe it," she told me. "The Ashworths were such a prominent family, so respectable. And to think they had that poor man locked up all those years. It made everyone question everything. If the Ashworths could hide something like that, what else might be hidden behind other closed doors?" That question, what else is hidden, is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the Harold Ashworth case. How many other secrets exist, locked away in attics and basements and hidden rooms? How many people are suffering in silence, invisible to the world? We want to believe the Harold Ashworth case was unique, an aberration, something that could never happen again. But history suggests otherwise. Even today, cases of family members kept in captivity for years or decades occasionally surface. The specifics differ, but the pattern is the same. A vulnerable person. Family members who prioritize reputation or convenience over compassion. And a society that doesn't look too closely at what happens behind closed doors. The case also raises difficult questions about Catherine Ashworth. Was justice served by her conviction? She served 7 years in prison before being paroled in 1967. She changed her name, moved to another state, and lived quietly until her death in 1998. Should she have been punished more severely? Or was she herself a victim who deserved compassion rather than imprisonment? There are no easy answers. She was both perpetrator and victim, shaped by her parents' cruelty, but ultimately responsible for her own actions. What happened to Harold Ashworth should never have been possible. But it was possible because society in 1930 and for decades afterward saw people with disabilities as problems to be hidden rather than people to be supported. It was possible because reputation mattered more than compassion. It was possible because we granted families too much privacy and authority over vulnerable members, without safeguards or oversight. We've made progress since 1960. Disability rights have advanced significantly. We have better systems for protecting vulnerable people. Mandatory reporting laws make it harder to hide abuse. But we haven't solved the fundamental problem. People with disabilities still face discrimination, neglect, and abuse. Family members still sometimes prioritize their own needs over those of the vulnerable people in their care. And we still sometimes look the other way, assuming that what happens inside a family is no one else's business. Harold Ashworth's story is a reminder that it is our business. That society has a responsibility to ensure all people, especially the most vulnerable, are treated with dignity and compassion. That privacy cannot be an excuse for abuse. I think about Harold often, about what his life might have been if he had been born in a different time, to a different family, about the experiences he was denied, sunlight, friendship, the simple ability to move freely, about 30 years spent in a single room, chained to a wall, while life continued without him just floors below. And I think about the fact that when he was finally freed, he had less than 2 years of freedom before he died. 2 years to experience what most of us take for granted. It wasn't enough. It could never have been enough. This has been the story of Harold Ashworth and the 30 years he spent hidden in an attic in Lenox, Massachusetts. A story of family cruelty, societal failure, and one man's stolen life. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Case Files. I know these stories are difficult to hear, but they're necessary. They remind us why protections for vulnerable people exist, why we can't simply trust that families will do the right thing, why society must remain vigilant. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases. And please share this video. Help ensure that Harold Ashworth's story is remembered, that his suffering wasn't meaningless. Leave a comment and tell me, do you think Catherine Ashworth received appropriate justice? Should there be a memorial to Harold in Lenox? How can we ensure such abuse never happens again? And if you know someone who is vulnerable, a child, an elderly person, someone with disabilities, check on them. Make sure they're okay. Make sure they're being treated with dignity and care. Because Harold Ashworth's tragedy began when everyone assumed someone else was looking out for him. Rest in peace, Harold James Ashworth. You deserved so much better than what this world gave you. You deserved freedom, dignity, and the chance to live your life on your own terms. You were finally freed in 1960, and while it came far too late, I hope those final 18 months gave you at least some measure of peace. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never assume that because something is hidden, it doesn't exist. Because behind closed doors, in attics and basements across the world, people may be suffering. And they're depending on the rest of us to care enough to ask questions, to check, to intervene when necessary. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host. And Harold Ashworth's name deserves to be remembered, not as a victim who disappeared, but as a person who existed, who mattered, and whose tragedy must never be repeated. Finally free, Harold. Finally free.